You are listening to Hear Her Sports, the podcast for everyone who loves stories by and about female athletes and other women in sport. I am your host, Elizabeth Emery. It's exciting to be talking about basketball again, about the NCAA Final Four in Cleveland, Ohio, where I live. Let's keep the energy up for women's sports because Cleveland's bid for a pro soccer team is in for this next round of NWSL expansion. A little shout out to the podcast Casual FC and the hosts Mario and Angela, who made me aware of everything that can happen when a pro women's sports team comes to a city. I very, very much wish that for Cleveland, and selfishly, I wish it for me. I'd love to experience what it's like to live in a place supporting a women's sports team. And it would be so awesome for Cleveland, which is a huge sports town, to support and enjoy a women's team. But moving on to introducing today's guest, Lynn Holzman. She and I met at a City Club of Cleveland panel about the NCAA Final Four coming to Cleveland. Lynn, who was on the panel, is here today for a post-Final Four weekend discussion and to look forward to the ongoing growth of women's basketball. Lynn is the NCAA Vice President of Women's Basketball, responsible for the strategic direction, oversight, operations, and management of women's basketball in Divisions 1, 2, and 3. Lynn is the one overseeing site selection for the championships. We talk about some possible changes coming up in that process and how so much has changed between when Cleveland was selected and when the event actually took place this past March. Lynn also talks about how she ended up working on the administrative side of sports and how important being a collegiate athlete was for her. At Kansas State University, she was the captain of the women's basketball team and a 3-time academic All-Big 8 team member. She also earned a Master of Arts degree from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a Master of Business Administration from Purdue University. Lynn shares stories of supporters who have led her to where she is today. We also talk about consequences of the pandemic on women's sports, the value of sport for players and fans, the NCAA Equity Report that came out after Sedona Prince's weight room TikTok in 2021, the emotional impact of that report, and being a natural introvert but learning how to use her voice through practice. One reason I wanted to have Lynn on Hear Her Sports is because of what she said on the City Club panel about wanting to encourage women to go into the business of sport. There are ways other than in coaching to stay in sports after a collegiate career as a player. She had help discovering that, but as she points out, it's not always an obvious path. Share this episode with your young sporty women friends and training partners who maybe don't know what they want to do when they grow up. Having more women in positions to make decisions is so important. I'm going to get off my little soapbox now. Here's Lynn Holzman. Lynn, thank you so much for being here. Hello, and welcome to Hear Her Sports.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. I'm really excited to have you here. We met, it was probably about a month before the Final Four weekend at a City Club panel that you were part of called Growth of the Game, an inside look at Cleveland's hosting of the NCAA Women's Final Four. You know, you guys were so terrific. You were terrific. The whole panel was terrific. And I thought it would be fun to have you here to sort of talk about, you know, what your thoughts are since the Final Four. Would you like to start just by giving us some impressions of what you thought?
Sure. You know, obviously, Cleveland did a tremendous job hosting the 2024 Women's Final Four, but it really was representative of the success we saw across the board for the entirety of the 2024 Division I Women's Basketball Championship. There was a multitude of records that were set, and to culminate all of that in Cleveland, where there were just for that city and that community to be able to bring what was a phenomenal story around women's basketball, how it's indicative of what's been happening in women's sports, how the community leaned in to being part of the event. It really was a way to kind of cap everything off for this season of women's basketball.
I'm assuming you were there in Cleveland during the event.
Oh, yes, I was there.
Well, good. Do you have a particularly great story of, you know, something that, I don't know, models the success that you saw?
There's two I'll offer up. I have probably many, but there's two. First, one of the things I would point to really how Cleveland turned out and supported Women's Final Four. As part of the weekend, we have what's called an open practice, and that's on Saturday, of which the two final teams, there's an opportunity for the teams to have a public practice session, if you will. And it's about 50 minutes for each of the teams. We started doing this event back in Minneapolis in 2022. In Cleveland, the reason it was really monumental is that it provides an access point, especially for those in the community that may not have tickets for the game, but it's a way to really get into the arena, Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, to really see all the energy around the teams. And it's a way, it's an opportunity through our ancillary events for the public to turn out. The reason it was monumental is that we set a significant record, both in pre-registrants for the event. It was a free event, by the way, but we do ask registrants for safety and other data collection reasons to register for the event. We had close to 20,000 individuals pre-register for the event and just under 12,000 that turned out. So for that environment, to have our two teams and those athletes, kind of conduct that pseudo practice, but to really see their personalities come out, there's music, there's ESPN broadcasting. Our corporate partners are doing some activations within that. But again, it's a place for, in a general admission setting, people just to come in and experience what it's like to be in Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse and the event itself. I also want to point out that we outdrew the men's basketball for the open practice session. And that was the first year we ever did that. The second story that I'll point to is simply the energy and the vibe that the women's Final Four really encapsulated during the weekend. And in particular, in the arena again during the games. And that is something I think that's really unique. And it's an element of our championship that we have to continue to embrace and really lift up, because as I'm assuming you were there in the arena, it was so loud. The energy, people singing, dancing around first the semifinal games and then the championship. I've been part of numerous championship events and women's Final Fours throughout my career, but it was the loudest I've ever heard it. People were just enjoying themselves, and it really is demonstrative of what sport does. And it brings people together. It really brings a sense of community. And I think the crowd also represented just the excitement and high degree of energy that we're experiencing around women's sports. So for me, that was a catch your breath moment.
I could not believe how loud it was. I was at the final game and it was deafening. It was so loud. Mm-hmm. Like you, I've never experienced anything like that. It was incredible. And it was super exciting just to be part of all, like that whole arena that was so excited about a women's basketball game or any women's sport. It was great.
Yeah. And the championship game, backed it up. It was a great competitive game. And I think that's obviously the crowd really gets into that as well. It was such a tremendous platform for our student athletes and our teams to, vie for that championship trophy. And for the crowd, you felt you really were part of the game that was going on.
One of the things that really stuck out to me during the City Club panel was how different 2024 is from when Cleveland first was awarded the bid. And you guys talked about that a little bit, but could you talk now more about, what that difference was and sort of what had to happen because 2024 is so different than it was just a few years ago?
Cleveland was, along with some other cities, was awarded the opportunity to host Women's Final Four back in 2019. And that is after a highly competitive process as we award Women's Final Fours. And in fact, we're already awarded out through 2031. And as we know, Cleveland hosted previously. For Cleveland to be back at the table and then selected by our women's basketball committee to host, that in and of itself was a great coup for the city of Cleveland and the community. Now, back in 2019, we were certainly still in a very intentional growth phase around our championship. And when I use the word growth, it's a multifaceted word. It's that we were looking to grow the fan experiences, the student athlete experiences, looking that through the entirety of the championship to increase attendance. Granted, when Cleveland got the bid, we have been and we were selling out Women's Final Four, and that is an absolute expectation. It's not even an ask any longer. But even back in 2019, when they were awarded, we had fan experiences and ancillary events, for example. Now, if you fast forward to 2024, what happened in between all of that? There's several different things that happened. As we know, during that time, we all went through the pandemic, and during the pandemic, I think one of the things that, again, that came out of that in a positive way around sports is that as leagues, professional leagues, and the NCAA, men's and women's basketball, figured out how to safely conduct sporting events during that time in our championships, sports, I think, kind of re-entered in some ways into our American culture, if you will. So women's sports in particular at that time really started to rise. During that period of time, there was other contributing factors to the elevation of women's sports, that women's basketball as being one of the premier leaders historically for women's sports really had a platform by which to showcase what are all the great things around women's sports and the unique elements around it that really bring in different fan bases. But through all of that, as we grew, there was also a gender equity report that was issued after the 2021 championship in San Antonio that really outlined publicly many of the things that myself and predecessors of myself and many other stakeholders and leaders in women's sports in the collegiate space had been advocating and really working toward for years. But that report really fast forwarded and put on that public display where there were discrepancies between what we were doing for specifically our women's basketball championship, women's Final Four, and otherwise. So you have these factors, and then this very quick then trying to reconcile an investment into our women's Final Four and our championship, that then a city like Cleveland, first it was Minneapolis after the gender equity report, they hosted in 2022, 2023 was Dallas, hosted women's Final Four in 2024 was Cleveland. Those three cities, the bar around what we expected, needed, and how we needed those cities to help support what we wanted to deliver, because we also had more resources on our side, but we needed our cities to partner with us to come to the table in order to deliver this elevated experience for our teams, our student athletes, the fan ancillary events, the experiences, where our corporate partners were going to activate and otherwise. So I think one of the things I would point out is that the financial investment that Cleveland signed up for back in 2019 was easily 5, 6, 7 times, and I'm talking millions of dollars, different than what we needed Cleveland to do. Now, to be fair, there was also the opportunity for Cleveland to recoup that and much more because of the economic impact of our event, because it's elevated in such a significant way.
Since you mentioned that equity report that was done by Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink after Sedona Prince showed the differences in the weight room, can you talk about, like, specifically from your position and your work, like, what did you see? What was the fallout from that report? And, like, what immediately happened at your job?
Well, even during the 2021 championship, as some of the things on social media came across, and to be really, I mean, to be fair, I think that the very important thing is that our players, our student athletes, our coaches, and others, because again, during the pandemic, there were so many eyes on what was happening in sport. And it really was because both the men's Division I men's and women's basketball championships are being conducted at singular locations, men's in Indianapolis, the women's in San Antonio. Really, for the first time in the history of the event, it provided much more of a real-time comparative opportunity between the two events in a public forum. So social media, showing some things, whether they were exactly on point or not, is not the issue, because at the end of the day, it was a point in time that we could look at and see, and the public, our players and others could question, well, why is this happening? And I firmly believe that in our country, whether it's sports or otherwise, it is more times than not that it requires crisis or a public outcry in order for us to get things substantively done and on a quicker timeline. Because as I mentioned before, we've been working to get the women's basketball championship elevated. We've been working to get more financial resources and other resources to close that equity gap. So even during 2021, as things became apparent, and whether that was through public reveal or just immediately staffs looking at, okay, well, why is this happening? Why is this happening? We saw immediate changes. Some of those things were, for example, the direct student athlete experience when we were doing things within those two different communities. Now, what I would point out, publicly, what we saw immediately and coming as a result of the first gender equity report, the women's basketball championship, now we use March Madness as one of our brands associated with it. And prior to that, it wasn't used. And we can look at the report and there's explanation and things pointed to as to how we ever got to that space as the NCAA. The student athlete journey we like to talk about for both men's and women's basketball, we document and we look at everything from selection Sunday for both championships to the time a national champion is crowned to make sure that there are equitable experiences for our student athletes in our programs. And that was one of the things just out of the gates that we were immediately attentive to, and rightfully so, is that student athlete experience. One other thing that I would point to as a result of the gender equity report is that you've seen a increased investment by the NCAA corporate partners and champions, and in a more visible way invested into our championship. Our corporate partners and champions, they support all 90 of our championships, but the visible way of which, especially with fan activations, it leaned much more toward men's basketball than on the women's side. And so a fan now, if they come into our tourney town versus the men's fan fest, they're going to see a multitude of our corporate partners. And this year in Cleveland, for example, we had every single one of them activate within that fan setting. Again, they've been investing in other ways, whether it's through supplying product and other expense offsets, but to really have that public facing, I think is important because it shows for the public that corporate America is investing in women's sports, and then their brands are visible and they get the benefits of it.
It must have been sort of exciting during this time with Sedona Prince pointing out and all the public commentary and also that gender equity report. It must have been exciting for you to sort of like get that boost of all the work that you had been doing, sort of to supercharge it in a way, I guess.
I mean, to be honest, I would personally say it was a myriad of emotions, because when you're there and you're in the midst of it, and with the team that I work with and our committee, as we were putting on that championship, to be frank, it was painful. And it was painful because we care so much. And when you care so much and you feel like you haven't delivered on what you want to deliver, it is very personal. It was very personal because as one of my core values around equity, and also what I've dedicated my career to around the student athlete experience, and in different ways elevating women in sports, to then have fingers pointed at you, and personally they were even pointed at me because I'm in the chair to say you didn't do this. But part of working through all those emotions was to having to remind the team I work with and even myself is that we were trying, we were advocating, we were asking, and I use that word intentionally, asking for more resources, making a case as to why there should be more investment in women's basketball and in the women's basketball championship. And then as you move along the spectrum of emotions, there was this point of which I had to do an intentional pivot and really see the opportunity that was now in front of us, which was to fully embrace the fact that we were in the public eye, and it was a time that we could move from asking and move to expecting, because we earn this, we deserve it, and we will continue to prove to everyone that investing in women's sports and women's basketball in our championship is not just the right thing to do, it is a sound business decision.
If you are enjoying this episode and would like to support what we're doing to give voice to female athletes and women in sport, go to buymeacoffee.com/hearher. Any amount is so appreciated. All of your support goes to producing Hear Her Sports, so that mostly means hosting fees, editing software, and organizational tools. Thank you so much for helping out. To support the show in a non-financial way, it is always a huge help when you let your friends know that you're listening to Hear Her Sports podcast. With so many podcasts out there, it is hard to discover new ones. Let your friends know about the Hear Her Sports Spotify playlist to get them started. You can find links to those at hearhersports.com or just go to Spotify.
Greetings from Evergreen Podcasts. We're rolling out a listener survey and we want to hear from you. The information in the survey will help us gather statistics and in turn make our shows more appealing to advertisers. I know most people don't like ads, but this is one of the only ways our shows make money and help keep their lights on. We promise it will only take a few minutes, but the impact on our podcasts will be tremendous. As a token of our appreciation, we'll randomly select one lucky participant each month to win an exclusive merchandise package from Evergreen Podcasts. Head to evergreenpodcast.com/listenersurvey to help a show and possibly get some free stuff for doing so. We can't thank you enough for the support. Now back to the show.
And now, back to Lynn Holzman, the NCAA Vice President of Women's Basketball. So let's go to the success of 2024 here in Cleveland, the Final Four. Like, what are you going to see as the impact of that success? Like, what changes are you expecting now?
Well, some of the, from the, I would say, operational side around the women's basketball, the championship, and then women's Final Four, as we have already been months into planning for 2025 with Tampa Bay and their community, and they'll be the first ever 4-time host of women's Final Four. And they were there, as well as many of our future sites in Cleveland, and seeing how Cleveland produced and put on women's Final Four with us. But we're going to see in Tampa, coming out of Cleveland, the next chapter of elevating those fan ancillary events, the experiences, as we do Party on the Plaza, which is that pregame pep rally that happens outside the arena, as we do Bounce, which is the over 2,000 kids with basketballs and T-shirts that take a route to end up at Tourneytown. What happens in Tourneytown? We're seeing from Cleveland that Tampa has to have more space. They have to be able to accommodate more people because of what happened in Cleveland and the other stakeholder events we have going on. We need more hotel rooms in Tampa than we ever have before. We need more hospitality locations for our fans. And then as we offer fan experience hospitality packages. So securing all those venues, it's another chapter of this entire story that we're writing as we move from the Cleveland community into the Tampa Bay community. And again, they're a 4-time host, and their eyes were wide as they saw what was going on in Cleveland. And in fact, last week, I was even in Tampa, and we're sitting there, and these are some of the same people that have hosted with us in the past. And the last time was 2019, in fact, and they are like, this is a different event. Yes, it is an absolutely different event from when you hosted before.
That's cool. So what are the challenges going to be? Like, where do you think you're going to be like having to work harder?
Some of the challenges we face, and for specifically for women's Final Four, we traditionally conduct our women's Final Four in NBA, NHL arenas. And as we talked about, that is a great game environment. It's a great fan experience. It's a great environment for our players. But as we are in these arenas, we are bursting at the seams. The number of trucks ESPN as our broadcast partner brings, the number of cameras that they use to enhance that broadcast experience, we have to essentially create, because there's not enough room in the loading docks for all these. They bring their 3 Monday Night Football trucks. I think they had a total of 9 semis to help produce the games. So we have to create essentially a compound outside the arena for them. Oh, and by the way, just with ESPN, you're talking about well over 300 credentialed individuals that you also have to feed. So you have to figure out where you put them. We've experienced year over year increased demands by credentialed media to come in. So again, you have to have the space for those individuals. You have to have the space to have the press conferences. They need to eat. They need to be able to use restrooms, all of those things. So all of these behind the scene components are really putting a lot of pressure on our buildings. And so as we move into Tampa, we are now talking about, in particular, I'll focus on the arena, the playing venue right now, of creating a campus environment around it. And the good thing is that a place like Tampa, we have greater confidence in the weather to be able to do that. But it allows us around the arena to do some different things to provide a little bit of relief for all those individuals that have to work in the arena to do their jobs.
Right. And what are you working on now? Like, I read somewhere that you're thinking about moving one of the meetings that was going to happen in 2025, and you want to push that up to work on the bids for future cities. Was that what it was about?
Well, one of the things around the women's basketball championship, and you saw some of this fodder as we went through the championship this past year, is that women's basketball, different than men's basketball, our earliest rounds of the championship, our first four and first and second rounds, they are still, it's conducted at campus hosted, what we call non-predetermined sites. That means you don't know where you're going to play those games until the bracket comes out, which is that Sunday night. And then you have to quickly get ready to play games starting on Wednesday. So having non-predetermined sites, and those typically are awarded to the top 16 seeds within the bracket. So not knowing where you're going means that we actually have a pool of about 25 to 30 schools that could, by the committee, be awarded a top 16 seed. And we have secured or on hold various hotels, and you have branding and signage that's ready to be shipped to some of these campus locations. Well, conversely, if we knew where we were going to play those games, if we knew that first four and first and second round was going to be played in a neutral predetermined location, we would have had months under our belts around the signage, and everything would be ready at the venue for the teams just to walk in, and you have to do the unique team signage. The hotels would absolutely be at the caliber and the quality of what we see for our regionals and thereafter. But when you go into some campus environments such as Storrs, Connecticut, Blacksburg, Virginia, if you go into Lawrence, Kansas, or Manhattan, Kansas, I'll use that as my alma mater, the number and the quality of hotels, just because of where that's geographically located and what inventory they have, may not be at the level that we want to provide for our championship. So point being is that issue around our earliest rounds, our women's basketball committee had already said they planned to review that after the 25 championship, because that was a point in time they felt that, okay, we expect we're going to see this kind of growth. Well, we've seen it quicker. And we've also seen an increased number of questions, not just by media, but also our own program saying, should we be at predetermined neutral sites or not? So that'll be a question that we will put in front of our membership to gather feedback. And then ultimately a decision will be made. And I want to be clear, even if a decision's made to remain for some reason at this point in time to campus hosted non-predetermined sites, that's not a decision of perpetuity. The committee can come back then in a couple of years, they'll review it again, look at all the data, look at the business models, and they could make a decision then. So it's just what is best for our championship now, as you talk about growth and wanting to make sure you create that great game environment I talked about at Women's Final Four at those very early rounds of the championship on campus.
It sounds like a planning nightmare not to have the predetermined locations. I would not want to be in charge of that.
It's a challenge, and I'm very fortunate that I have a great team of staff members that work in women's basketball, and there's months and years planning, but it's until Sunday evening when the bracket comes out that suddenly you can hit go and figure out where we have things positioned literally on pallets throughout the country, and then can get it shipped and to arrive within 20 hours in some location.
Yeah, well, I hope that changes for you, for your sake and your team's sake. So let's talk about media. So what changes are going to be happening in media? What were you excited about this time around with the media?
Well, a lot of things to be excited about. I think one of the really important metrics out of this past women's Final Four is our championship game had 18.9 million viewers. We, for the first time in the 42-year history of the championship, we outdrew the men's basketball, Division I men's basketball championship game. So that was very significant and very monumental for women's basketball and women's sports overall. ESPN will continue as the broadcast partner for our women's basketball championship, and we are about to move into a new deal that was announced back in January. The NCAA has with a multitude of our championships, including women's basketball. The reason I'm excited about that is not just the fact that it's a new deal and that there is a significantly increased rights fee associated with that, but women's basketball is a cornerstone of that deal. And what that means is that it was imperative for ESPN to retain our women's basketball championship because we are one of their most significant properties. As part of that deal, there's also increased storytelling that we'll see around our women's basketball programs and teams, along with some other sports. Through the deal, our championship game is now guaranteed on ABC, and we've been on ABC the last 2 years, but it's now a contractual guarantee. There's some other components in the sense of the type of exposure that ESPN will provide. So it's important that we've raised the bar with that ESPN deal, and that is representative of what has happened the last couple of years, that they obviously really wanted to continue to invest and pay for those rights around the women's basketball championship. The other things I'm excited about with media is just across the board, again, as women's basketball ends up being one of several sport property leaders around this narrative of women's sports and just the excitement that fans and others are having. And we're seeing a carry through from what happened in our season and our championship into the WNBA, as we're seeing these player storylines that have been developed in the collegiate space now carrying through to the WNBA. I'm excited about that because for the ecosystem of girls and women's basketball, that really speaks to the fact that all ships can rise, and we are fully invested in that. More traditional media, print media, and then I'll throw in also social media and the different platforms we use. We continue to see just record-setting numbers in the sense of coverage and also engagements and many of the other metrics that we can apply to that. So I expect that that's going to continue. You know, I think this past year we had such a tremendous storyline around Caitlin Clark and the undefeated season of South Carolina, LSU defending the national title. What we saw this past season, though, also that the media is really going to help continue to elevate women's basketball and women's sports is the grouping of student athletes and programs that are ready to take that torch and continue to carry it through. There was a tremendous freshman class this past year, a lot of excitement that has brought fans out that now really are invested in women's basketball. And media plays such a significant role in really helping showcase those players, their talents on the court and off. And that's really something that our fans can connect with.
I was really impressed that it seemed like there was investment, as you said, to have great coverage. You know, like I just can think of the big table with all the superstars talking about the game. And that to me seems so different than it's been in the past, that they've, you know, like they really are excited about the game. They want to talk about the game and they're very knowledgeable about the game.
Yeah, you know, I think there was a coolness factor around it. Like suddenly it became cool, you know, and there were pieces of it, but, you know, in years past, and there were pieces of it again this year, but you had the traditional armchair quarterback that would sit there and kind of poo-poo on women's sports and, oh, you know, but they can't dunk. Oh, but they can't do this or whatever. Well, the story of Caitlin Clark and what she did with the scoring record and hitting logo threes and everything really, it kind of disarmed a lot of that. And I think it's also vitally important, and this started a few years ago. We started to see high-profile men's basketball, NBA players and others be supportive of women's basketball. The WNBA, by wearing the orange hoodie, by coming to games, we can't underplay that because that gives credibility And when Steph Curry and Kevin Durant and these other players talk about and they legitimize the skill and the athleticism and what is happening on the court for women's basketball, that I think really carried through to this past season because it was backed up by the performances of many of our players. That it started years ago with Sabrina, but it really, I think, showcased itself this year. So the coolness factor then, where fans and others are talking about it, I feel like media doesn't have but a choice to lean into it because that's what people want to read and they want to hear about, and they want to talk about the the matchup of LSU versus South Carolina, and they want to talk about all these other parts of the game that really draws in even more sport fans and others.
Yeah. One of the things that I noticed when I was preparing to talk to you was the panel that you were on at City Club was absolutely fantastic. And the Women's Sports Foundation put on a panel during the Final Four at Hawken, which was also incredible. And it just seems to me like there's this elevated discussion level. And I just wanted to hear what your thought was about bringing this Final Four to a community, to Cleveland, and to having, for example, maybe a pro team in a city, like what that does to the community and the understanding and respect and love of the women's sports game, whatever the sport.
Yeah, I think the women's Final Four, the championship, and other major mega elite sporting events, and I'll say women's sporting events, what it does is it provides a platform then to have those conversations. And because, the city is providing the exposure and promotion and everything, then suddenly you have people that want to engage in a conversation differently, or they want to learn and really figure out, investigate to see what is this all about? Like, why does this really matter? And then at that point, I think as we brought them in, I think it resonates with a lot of people as they think about what, and on that panel, I remember us talking about, Title IX was only adopted in 1972. The NCAA has only had women's championships since 81, because that's when the NCAA took over the AIAW, essentially. We've only had 42 years, now going into the 43rd year of a women's basketball championship. So there's a story, a narrative that we can refer to there that I think some in the community, whether it's because it's women and women leaders that hopefully at some point they had a chance to play, or if they didn't, it kind of resonates with them saying, I didn't get the chance. We have these conversations with female business leaders within the community, and then it starts to draw in others of the community, men, any other business leaders or whatever, because again, as you're influenced by the media, as we look at, why is this event such a big deal? What is all this it's good noise that's happening to get people into the room? And then suddenly they're like, oh, you know what, that really did happen. Oh, my sister didn't get to play. Why didn't she get to play? Well, I don't think that's right. And suddenly it starts to kind of connect, I think, to some individuals' morals and ethics, and they really start to kind of intellectualize or start to question it. And I think that's one of the things I enjoyed so much about that City Club conversation, as well as some of these others, and why these panels continue to be so important is because we're out in the open having this dialogue about where we've been, where we are, and where we want to go, which is forging our own path in a lot of ways.
At the City Club, you did mention that you were a child of Title IX, product of Title IX. What is it like to look back and from your position today of somebody who's, a leader?
As I reflect back, and I reference that now, I think some of it is respective of the age I'm at now, but also as having gone through the gender equity report and some of these monumental things this past year, these past couple of years. But reflecting back on it, I think is important because I recognize now that, and myself having been born in 1972, ironically, I knew my mom was a great athlete, but she didn't have a chance to play. It was actually my mom that taught me how to play softball and to throw a ball and to go out there and to play basketball, and my sisters and everything. But when I reflect back, and because of the gender equity report, and I think back to my experiences in high school, in college. And now I realize that there were inequities when I played. And now I realize that, and I can ask the question of, why was it that the men got all these shoes, more uniforms, their locker rooms were better, they got to play on, the great Coliseum court at Kansas State, and we got to play in the old Fieldhouse court. But at the time, I didn't know any different. So that's part of the reflection and the experiences that I have, is to point back to that and to try to make sure that, even though at the time I didn't realize there were inequities, that the student athletes I serve, and that as I think about our future generations, they're not going to have to ask those same questions of why. Why is it different? Why does this not feel fair?
Do you have any, regret's not quite the right word, but sort of like, why didn't I get that opportunity? Like, why didn't I have the opportunity to play in the better Coliseum? Why didn't I get more equity? Like, what could have happened? Why wasn't there WNBA?
And yeah, I don't know if I would use the word regret either,
Right. Yeah.
because to me, it's part of the evolution. And I also think about it in the sense of, it's not just women in sport, it's women within our society, and the rights that we've been, that have taken time to achieve. That's when women could have a credit card, when women could have a mortgage, when women, trying to make sure that there's equal pay for equal work. So what has occurred in women's sports over that time, to me, is also, it's connected to this slow path that we've been experiencing even within our own country around women's rights and opportunities. And that's a big thing about Title IX itself, is that it's a law, but it's about the opportunity and having the opportunity to play. And I want to be clear that, I think in some ways I'm fortunate, because I have friends and others that, I went to a public school. There was a girls' basketball team. I went to a public school. We had a softball team, and I played. We had volleyball. We had both boys and girls soccer. But I have friends and colleagues that they didn't have the softball team, but they had the baseball team. They had boys soccer, but not girls. So I feel fortunate in the sense that, yeah, there were discrepancies and differences and everything, but the experiences I had were pretty darn good for what North Royalton High School could offer at the time. And the timing by which I graduated from high school, I also got a full athletic scholarship to play basketball at Kansas State University. If I had graduated 5 years earlier, that probably wouldn't have been the case, because even though Title IX had been adopted in 72, there still was not an equal offering across Division I and all colleges and universities around scholarships for men and women. So, I was at an interesting point in time of which, being a beneficiary of Title IX, but it still wasn't, and nor are we still, I would say, in every single instance at the case of full equity. Now, here's an example on that. I distinctly remember being in high school, and, the Sports Illustrated would come out and they'd do their college basketball preview, right? And I remember I was always so excited just to be able to see that there was one page dedicated to the top 20 for women's basketball. And there was usually a 1 or 2 page spread that featured one player. And I remember my senior year, it was Stanford was number 1, and the featured player was Jennifer Azzi. And that was a big deal to me, in the fact that women's basketball was in Sports Illustrated. But the interesting thing is that from Title IX and media and everything, let's just say it's a 60-page magazine, 3 pages were dedicated to women's basketball, of a college basketball preview. But at the time, it was like, I accepted it, and I was like, "Ooh, they have women's basketball."
One of the things that I've discovered in the podcast is that experiences of early Title IX girls vary so much depending on where in the country you live and what kind of school you went to. So it's interesting to hear your take on that. And I'm glad, in terms of this spread, like how we used to be so happy with so little, I'm glad that is changing as well. I think that's nice. So how did you find your way into the business of sports?
Sports have always been a very instrumental part of my life. And that was from an early age. Sport was a place of which my family connected, where I have 4 siblings. I have a brother and 3 sisters. And that was really the time, because I grew up on a small farm, but outside of doing all that type of stuff, that's the way we would connect as a family. So having those earlier influences and then being, drugged to all the high school sporting events for my brother, quarterback of the football team, played basketball, baseball, and then my older sisters, I just connected very deeply with sport. Frankly, also sport was a place that as a painfully shy child, and also I was always taller than everyone. And as we know, body image as a young woman, as a girl, is often something that we struggle with, but sport was a place that it was okay. And I could bring my full self into it. So again, it connected very deeply for me. And then sport, frankly, was a way for me to continue my education through a full athletic scholarship. And I chose to play basketball for that opportunity. To be fair, I was better at softball, but I knew basketball was going to be a way to get my education paid for. And then through that, when it got time to kind of move out of undergrad and to figure out my next steps, there was suddenly an eye-opening in the sense of I could go into coaching, and I've been doing some youth basketball coaching at that point, try to pursue the coaching route, or I could look at some other continuing my education. And I got my sport management degree from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And then from that, I started working at the NCAA the first time I was here at the national office. So I quickly went on an administrative track. I often say playing college sports transformed my life. It did. It provided purpose. It provided connection, the intersection of education, which again is a very much a personal value, but also sport provided a place that I felt I could blossom as a person and really grow into myself. And then so transferring that into a career for something that impacted me so dramatically was almost a no-brainer. And it's really is part of the fabric of who I am.
It seems like it would have taken some forethought, because there were not a ton of women doing what you're doing now at that time when you were starting to pursue it.
Yeah, and when I mentioned the coaching thing, is that as a student athlete, I was blind to really all the other opportunities outside of the coaching track. That's just what I knew. And it was during my time at Kansas State, my 5th year, because I graduated with 2 degrees. So my 5th year when I was done playing, but I had started working in the athletic department in the ticket office at the Coliseum, but I crossed paths with our athletic director at the time. And I think this is an important lesson about how what some may think are seemingly insignificant interactions can actually be so impactful on young people. But it was through a conversation the athletic director had with me, of which he actually asked the question, have you ever thought about trying to do what I do? And I was
Wow.
Oh, I never really thought about that before. He's like, and he, as a older gentleman in his position, by simply saying that, lit some kind of fire in me. And I was like, oh, I can actually do this as a career. I don't have to start with the coaching track to then figure out how later to get into administration. And that really inspired me to pursue a master's degree in sport administration. And then again, that kind of connected an opportunity for me to start at the NCAA as a postgraduate intern. And my career took off from there.
Good for that guy.
Yep.
You mentioned being a painfully shy young person, and I'd love it before you go if you could explain about this accomplishment that you mentioned in our offline conversation. And I'm quoting, "I've learned to use my voice and influence more." Can you talk a little bit about that?
My personality traits, which I own, and I talk about this a lot, is that I'm a natural introvert. So kind of very much in my head a lot. I know myself in the sense of when you have to really pour energy into a situation, but also finding that time to recover and recharge. And I say that in a sense that as I have moved into leadership positions, not just management of people, but leadership positions, such as being the vice president of women's basketball, with that comes a responsibility of being a public facing figure. And with that, it comes with needing to represent and advocate and be a voice for the sport that, in this case, women's basketball, that I oversee for the NCAA, and to be that servant leader. So through time, through mentoring, through watching how others behave, through intentionally trying to prepare myself for those situations, finding my voice is part of the responsibility of this position. But I think it's also that intrinsically for myself, I recognize that it's important that if I want to see the change, I have to play a role within that. So even if I didn't have the title, I care so much about what we're doing in women's sports and then women's basketball by the position I hold right now, that you have to move to a space of being uncomfortable in order to help make change happen. So I own that. But for me, again, because of those introvert tendencies, it is a consciousness by which I approach this. To be fair, though, too, it's become easier as I've moved along in my career, because as you kind of move through those opportunities to use your voice, then you gain more confidence. And on the gender equity thing, one of the things that I think is really significant is that I have found, because of what women's basketball has accomplished, what we've gone through, and what the potential is that the voice that is used has to no longer be one of asking, but it is expecting and demanding.
Well, thank you for acknowledging that sort of becoming more outspoken and using your voice actually took practice. I appreciate
it. It does.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It was great to have you here, and I'm really happy to have been able to sort of talk about the Final Four in Cleveland, which was so fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for today's show. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you to Lynn for her time. These kinds of overview discussions about issues in women's sports are important and a strong step in moving forward. I'm so grateful to Lynn, who was willing to share her expertise and passion for basketball. There are some fun links on her show notes page, including a link to Caitlin Clark on Saturday Night Live. It is well worth watching, and it is also related to some discussion on today's episode. Also on the website, find ways to email me, and please do. I love hearing from you. Also, take a look at all of the guests who have been on Hear Her Sports over the years. You can support what we are doing here from the support tab, where you will find links to Bookshop, Buy Me a Coffee, and Lagoon Pillows. But the best way to support the show requires no purchase at all, and it's really easy. Tell your friends, colleagues, and training partners about the show and one of your favorite episodes. Hear Her Sports is a member of Evergreen Podcasts. I appreciate their support and yours. It is so great to be part of this growing community of women's sports fans. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Hey there, and welcome to the Joy of Paddle podcast, hosted by me, Minter Dial, a veteran of the paddle tennis world, and sponsored by Paddle 1969. Whether you're a paddle tennis aficionado, just beginning, or have never even heard of paddle, or padel, as it's called in North America, this is an exhilarating new show that delves into the captivating stories of notable paddle personalities worldwide. In its inaugural season, you'll be treated to exclusive anecdotes, valuable tips, life lessons, and humorous moments shared by esteemed professional paddle players, industry insiders, and passionate paddle enthusiasts. With each season aligning with the Pro Tour, you can anticipate 2 engaging episodes per month. The Joy of Paddle podcast is part of the Evergreen Podcast Network, where you can find other great shows in a number of categories, such as sports, health and wellness, true crime, and fiction. To find out more about Evergreen Podcasts, go to www.evergreenpodcast.com. Vamos!